What does it mean to be lovable? Who gets to be loved and desired? And in what ways? We are told that romantic love is just a feeling into which you cannot help but fall. It's a supernatural part of the human experience, unmoored from the material world. And yet, in reality, why does it feel like desire falls along some pretty familiar lines? Why is porn literally categorized according to racist tropes? And why is Love Island so uncomfortable to watch?
Michael, as the last single guy, you are coupled up with the last single girl. You one day, off you go.
In 2014, OkCupid released data demonstrating how response rate to dating profiles is profoundly affected by your race. It found that Black women are the least likely to get responses, whilst white men are the most likely to get responses, but the least likely to respond themselves. The authors of the book, The Dating Divide, sought to discover the story behind these statistics. And they found that what matters most wasn't just the number of responses, but the actual responses themselves. They found that compared to white women, messages received by women of color on dating apps were far more likely to be objectifying, degrading, or even violent, often in ways that directly drew on sexualized racist tropes. In their study, women of color reported that their bodies were treated as fascinations, adventures, scandals, pathologies, and as less worthy of a deeper emotional relationship. What this body of data tells us is that race profoundly structures your experience of desire and commitment, and therefore the possibility of partnership. This is an example of what Avril Clark calls the inequalities of love. The idea that marital love is a resource, and like any resource under capitalism, it is distributed unevenly. For women, access to marital love has historically been tied to accessing other material resources, whether it's getting a bank loan, a mortgage, or intergenerational wealth. Now, obviously, getting positive attention on a dating website or even being married is not necessarily an indicator of being loved. But being excluded from these practices doesn't necessarily mean you are freed from their effects. Those who have been written out of our frameworks of romance, marriage, and domesticity experience a whole different set of issues. In her essay on colonial sexual politics, Sandra Ponzanesi explored how the twinned sexualized images of the harem and the Hottentot underpinned dominant artistic representations of women in Africa and the Orient, the modern-day Middle East. The Hottentot and the harem are quite different examples of how women of color have been historically desired. The harem was viewed in the West as the ultimate marker of power, potential spoils of war belonging to whichever sultan the colonizer envied and wished to usurp. The harem is represented as a room populated by concubines whose animalistic sexuality is under lock and key. Their bodies are loosely clothed, and it's implied that they are unaware they are being watched. Erotic thrill is generated through the tantalizing possibility of possessing something not available in the homeland. In a letter to his French mistress, novelist Gustave Flaubert gave an archetypal example of how the Oriental woman was conceptualized in the European imagination. Describing his encounters with famous Egyptian courtesan Kushuk Hanem, he writes, "The Oriental woman is no more than a machine. She makes no distinction between one man and another, smoking, going to the baths, painting her eyelids, and drinking coffee. Such is the circle of occupations within which her existence is confined. What makes this woman, in a sense, so poetic is that she relapses into the state of nature." The story of the Hottentot woman is a slightly different one. Images of the Hottentot are a paragon of commodification. The focus is on the minute, invasive, and dehumanizing details of an individual woman's body. Unlike the harem, which is viewed through a voyeuristic gaze, the Hottentot was put on display. She was staged by the European man who viewed himself as her owner. The archetypal example of the Hottentot is the case of Saartjie Baartman, a South African Khoikhoi woman whose body was toured around 19th century European circuses. Her particular body shape was put forward as representing the essence of all African women, and as an object of sick European fascination. This was intimately tied to eugenics, a scientifically false doctrine that connects socially defined characteristics like intelligence and criminality to inherited biological traits. Within this, the Hottentot was associated in both art and medical literature with unbridled, pathologized sexuality. Diagrams of African women's sexual organs were preoccupied with what was perceived to be an overdevelopment of the genitals. This was portrayed as a signifier of sexual excess, proving the women's pathological and animalistic nature. Even in her death, Saartjie Baartman was not spared the racialized misogyny of the European gaze. Her body remained on display in a Paris museum until 1974, more than 150 years after her death in 1815. What connects the images of the Hottentot and the harem is the total reduction of personhood to a body, to be consumed, observed, and commodified at will. In both cases, desire is underscored by revulsion and violence. Although originating in Europe, these frameworks were easily adaptable to the material needs of chattel slavery in the Americas, which required an abundant, constantly growing labor force. Black women and black men were both perceived and treated as subhuman commodities. But in women, this manifested through ideas around their ability to provide offspring that could be sold for the slave owner's profit. Once on the auction block, the reproductive and sexual features of women slaves were inspected for signs of being good breeders, and forced breeding with male slaves was not uncommon. After abolition, these legacies continued, particularly in the South. Whilst black men were being brutalized in the name of defending white womanhood, sexual violence against black women, particularly when committed by white men, was not even considered to be violence. What's more, the construction of racialized women's bodies as hypersexual and close to nature was done in contrast to the chaste cleanliness of the 19th century white woman, who, for her part, was bound by domesticity. As Bell Hooks writes in Ain't I a Woman, the shift away from the image of the white woman as sinful and sexual to that of the white woman as virtuous lady occurred at the same time as the mass sexual exploitation of enslaved black women. And when white women were deemed sexually deviant, this was represented through their proximity to black and brown bodies. Look at this famous Edward Manet painting, Olympia. The painting caused moral outrage upon its exhibition because typically at the time, nude women could only be portrayed as mythical characters like goddesses or allegories. But here, Manet painted a sex worker. This is implied by lots of things: her defiant stare, her half-worn slipper, and the black cat in the corner. But it's also coded by the presence of her black domestic worker, indicating that we are in an underground Paris brothel. Hundreds of pages of art criticism has been written unpacking the subjectivity of Olympia. Yet, until recently, what it means to be Law, the other woman in this painting, was hardly considered. For decades, she has just been part of the backdrop, a symbol through which her white counterpart is to be understood. Echoes of this relationship remain strong today. Remember in 2013 when Miley Cyrus tried to repackage herself from cute, infantile Disney do-gooder to edgy, grown-up provocateur? This involved highly strategic image changes, sexier clothes, sexier lyrics, and in a tale as old as Empire, the use of black women's bodies as tools to define herself. When it was pointed out to her at the time that this was somewhat objectifying, I don't doubt that she was authentically shocked. Those aren't my accessories, they're my homies. Within her conceptual framework, this is what it means to express love and desire for Black women.
You just gotta be a good person, and I think that's what being a role model is being gracious and being a good person.
However, we do good not to over-focus on moralizing about these particular examples or trying to police people's behaviors and who they find attractive. The racial politics of desire did not begin as individual choices in individual relationships, although they often come to light in these contexts. Creating better conditions for love is a structural job. It involves addressing the root material causes of why some human beings are seen as accessories to the lives, bodies, and sexuality of others. Women of colour feel the legacies of the harem and the Hottentot every time they open up a dating app or appear in the Love Island lineup. It becomes clear that while desire feels personal, it can still be very much political. So it's not about creating a checklist of relationship etiquette or telling people who they should and should not desire. It's about organising a fundamentally different society. Only then can a freer, more sexy kind of love emerge.